So we're talking today with Benjamin Warschawski, who is our soloist for the Bloch Sacred Service that we'll be performing on May 19th at Rodeph Shalom, a Sunday afternoon 5 o'clock concert, and again on June 2nd at 4 o'clock at Our Lady of Mount Carmel in Doylestown with the Bucks County Choral Society and the Nashirah Chorale, the Jewish Chorale of Philadelphia. And this is the concluding concert in a season devoted to concert settings of liturgical texts. We sang a Latin Mass by Bruckner at the beginning of the season. We sang Margaret Bond's setting of W.E.B. Du Bois's Credo. We sang for Christmas an Anglican Lessons and Carol service. And in the spring, we sang Rachmaninoff's great setting of the Eastern Liturgy, the All-Night Vigil in Czech Slavonic. And so we're concluding with this iconic setting of Bloch's sacred service. Benny, as he goes by, and I met back in 2012 when he was in Philadelphia, and we did the Kurt Weill Eternal Road, a reduced 2-hour version of the original 6-hour version. So tell me a little bit about what draws you to this role. This is the first time that you've performed it, right?
Yes.
You've had a long career as an opera singer and a cantor over, what, 20, 25 years now?
I don't like to admit it, but yes, it has been about that long at this point. It's just a fantastic work. It was really interesting to me. I didn't have a lot of thoughts about it because I always knew of this as a baritone's piece. But now that I see it, really and get to dive into the text, it just speaks so deeply to me. The things that impress me the most about it, that I like the most, is coming from the cantorial background. This sits right on the edge where I live. It's right between being a classical musician and a sacred musician. It combines both of them. Most often, when the Jewish liturgy, when you're singing the liturgical music, it's synagogue music written for that purpose, not necessarily meant to be done where people are sitting quietly and listening in a concert hall per se. And here, Bloch has taken the aesthetic of the German Choralschule, as they used to call it, the choir synagogue, the choral synagogue, and brought that into the classical format, into this high Western format, the symphonic or organ-based format, with this back and forth of the service with a cantor who functions less like an Eastern European cantor, but more like the German. They actually used to call them the Vorbeter, like the narrator, rather than a cantor. It's almost like a large-scale oratorio with a narrator, essentially, who has cantorial color. So that's been one of the most interesting things to see. How I know that format from Jewish books and all of our anthologies. As individuated pieces, little sections with a cantor and a choir, and then to see the entire liturgy here that Bloch put together in one is impressive, and as a Jew, very unique, because it's not a place where you usually hear your music displayed. So as I was looking through it, I heard some of the recordings with some serious, hefty baritones singing it, so I had that feel of the color. And when I looked through it, I realized it was written much more copying the style of sort of the two great Jewish Choralschule composers, that being Louis Lewandowski and Solomon Sulzer, where they really wrote the cantor part for like a generic middle higher voiced male. There's nothing particularly tenorish about it at all. It usually ends, around E, F, maybe a G will be in there once in a while. And then at the bottom, it usually doesn't go below a B flat or an A. So it's meant that a lot of people could sing it. And that was really what surprised me, was how I don't feel like I have to change my voice in any way really to do it. I can sing it pretty legitimately, honestly, even though it's a little lower in my repertoire than most of my other repertoire is. So that was really surprising to see that he really took that aesthetic feel and made it as possible for as many different artists, classical or cantorial, to sing it.
Any thoughts about, as someone who sings this liturgy every week, Bloch takes some liberties with texts that he includes, texts that he doesn't include. What are your thoughts about some of the choices he makes? The biggest one, I guess, is in the last movement where he sets the Adon Alom which is usually, I understand, a more of a simple hymn, and he makes it into something kind of existential. Josh Jacobson in his notes says, this was not a typical setting of Adon Alom. He probably the only composer who's attempted a literal setting of this cosmic poem with dramatic gestures, paints an eerie picture of a world before any living thing was created, and then a world after all things shall cease to exist, and then applies a more comforting brush to he is my God, my living Redeemer, my comfort in time of sorrow.
Yeah, this is straight out of that liturgy. It is a surprising choice in a sense. I think if you look at it musicologically, um, but it actually, I think it's a really deep liturgical choice on his part. I really do. You know, speaking as a cantor, particularly speaking about the Judeo-Christian tradition, you know, the church or the synagogue really, for much of its history, its primary function was the education of its people. That really was what it was about. You know, priests and rabbis were people of letters. They were the learned ones who could read. In the Jewish service, we read the entire service parts of it out loud, literally as a vestige to pre-printing press times when not everyone would be literate. So the cantor in the front would have to say all the words. So even if you could not read, you could mouth along and learn them over weeks by hearing the songs and the repetition. So Adon Olam, this liturgical poem, which is very deep, it's a tremendous statement of faith, is directly from that tradition. You have it in the Christian tradition as well. It is throughout the Jewish tradition where we make these short poems that are essentially idiomatic expressions that synthesize in a fairly short poem a tremendously large scale idea or a very large portion of a biblical story, so to speak, or a very large theological concept. And this is one of them. So this Adon, Jews in services, we end most every service with either Adon Olam or the Yigdal prayer, Adon Olam more ubiquitously during the daytime services. And this is one of those that's meant for anyone to be able to sing and learn easily. And you can hear it's basically a poetic statement of the entire theology of Judaism. It's telling you the creation story wrapped up within it, even if you don't know it. So the one I always like to tell, the example I like to give is it's like the expression, an apple a day keeps the doctor away, right? We all know that pithy little expression. That's what we all know. None of us really know what doctor we need to see or what our ailment is. But if we learn that expression, at least when you got something you don't know what to do, you know, hey, wait a minute. I should probably, if I don't want to be sick, I probably want to eat stuff that's nutritionally good. I get the basic point, you know?
Right.
So it's all down to one pithy statement. And that is Adon Olam, as it looks in a Hebrew prayer book. It's a short 8-stanza phrase that can be easily remembered. And if you can recite that throughout your life, you always know the basis of Jewish story. You know the creation story. God was there before all was formed. You know, he is one and there is no second is one of the lines. Hu echad, he is one. Ein sheni. So that immediately refers back to the Shema prayer, the Hero Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. So it's using the same words. So
crystallizations.
Yeah, they're like crystallizations of very large scale concepts into a phrase, into an apple a day keeps the doctor away kind of thing, so that people can remember it and don't necessarily have to sit in a library all of their life, 5 days a week, 10 hours a day to understand this stuff, but they can transmit the feeling, they can transmit the faith. So I think his choice to actually pull out Sur Yisrael instead of the Kaddish is amazing, because the Kaddish is really a doxology. It's more like the Lord's Prayer. The texts are more similar in that way. It's more like, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done.
It's not really about mourning explicitly.
Right. No mention of mourning at all. It's the greatness of God. It's truly like, it's where the Lord's Prayer comes from, liturgically speaking. So yeah, if you're looking at the prayer from the cry of a Jewish soul, particularly writing in the 1930s in Europe, I believe he was in Switzerland when he did write this. I think he went back at that time. I don't think this was written in the States, if my history is correct. Sitting there at that time, what would be a bigger cry when you need saving than the Kaddish? It would be Tzur Yisrael, where he says, you know, guardian of Israel, rock of Israel, be our guardian, please redeem us, and then offer as a final benediction. Why? Because we worship Adon Olam, the one God who is here before everything and will be here after. And again, as the last passage of Adon Olam, which I think it's so cool that the piece ends that way, the Adoaf Kidruchi, which in true translation is, into his hands I trust my spirit when I sleep or when I'm awake, and with him, with my spirit, whatever happens to me, it's going to be okay. So it's really a solace prayer at the end from this great theology. So I actually think it's a very surprising move by him, but as a clergyman and a musician, I sit here and say, man, that was savvy. That was a really savvy, sophisticated call.
Well, it made me think back to when I first attended bar mitzvahs of friends. The sermon that the bar mitzvah would give wasn't just an exposition of a passage. It was an argument with a passage. It was challenging it, probing it, as though it were a debate with the passage about what does this mean. It struck me that in this movement especially, Bloch is encountering these texts really somewhat for the first time, because he grew up primarily as a secular Jew, not regularly observant, but drawn to the tradition. And once he gives himself over to it completely and comes to this point where he's asking himself, what does this mean that we are created in this world? What does it lead to that after God is still there, God is still one, and it says that thou art with me, that there is nothing to fear.
Exactly. Yeah. And that poetry, that in Hebrew, it's biyado afkidruchi, into your hands I entrust my spirit. You know, say, it's all good. You got me. You got me.
In other words, I don't completely understand this. And there's things about it that I think, what's
I know, no matter how much I study it, I still only really know an apple a day keeps the doctor away.
Right. And yet I've come to this point where I have this relationship with you that I need to acknowledge the reality of and find a way to live into that.
It's so true. And it's so interesting you said that. I didn't expect to say this. This is one of these little pieces of Jewish Bible teaching I love to say that a lot of people don't know, is that the word Yisrael can have many meanings. You know, Hebrew is a root word language, so words morph their meanings a little bit. You know, like a yad is a hand, but yad or yedid is a friend. So hand in hand signifies friend. So these roots work together and make these complex things. And Yisrael, one of the constructions is Yasar El, which is the struggling with God. So Jews are the people who struggle with God. And I think you just put that beautifully, that Bloch was being a very good Jew. He was struggling with these texts and struggling to find where they fit as he was encountering them for the first times, and his feelings of where they should go if he were trying to make that feel for his congregation or for himself to the Lord. And so I think that's a really great way that you put that. He sort of struggled with them, just like one should, whether you're Jewish or not. Struggle with your religion. We all struggle with our existence, why we're here, what we're supposed to do. It's
right.
I thank you and bless you all so much for putting on this year of liturgical classical music, because I think it's a wonderful time, especially with all that's going on in the world, you know, to at least whatever one believes, to look back at some of the principles that have informed much of the last many hundred years of you know, Western civilization and world politics, et cetera, and how governments have gone and stuff. So a few other little things that are really interesting to me. First of all, Bloch is a Swiss composer, and I was born in Switzerland. As a matter of fact, my great-grandfather was the cantor in Basel around the same time. He was called there from the Alsace in, I think, 1903, and worked at the synagogue in Basel until just, I think, before the war, probably around the time Bloch finished this work. So, and just on a personal note, I don't know if it will be interesting to all, but I keep a picture of him with me that I'll have with me at the performance of him and all of his regalia.
Oh my gosh.
My great-grandfather, for whom I'm named, my middle name is Moshe, the Hebrew word for Moses. And his name, he was French, he was Alsatian, so his name was Moïse, but my parents, knowing they were raising an American kid, at least gave me Moshe instead of Moïse. So that's my great-grandfather Moïse, and literally inside this little thing is one of the handkerchiefs he used to keep with him on the pulpit.
Oh my gosh.
So I'm really excited that, I don't know that I don't have a direct connection to Bloch in any other way, but just this idea that my great-grandfather, who was a cantor in the same country around the same time, wearing that garb and singing that style of music that impressed so much upon Bloch. I think
Well, it's a wonderful story, and I hope you'll share that and show that picture and that cloth to the choirs, because I know that would mean a lot to them. I know one of the there's one movement that is actually the unaccompanied section in the third movement, the silent devotion and response, that I've done both in churches where I've been director, and when I would sing as part of the quartet in Reformed synagogues in Long Island and Connecticut when I was in school. That would be something frequently sung as well.
Right. It's such good music and good experience.
Quiet movement. It's incredibly personal and
oh my gosh,
devotional.
Again, I think that from the answer I was speaking from your great question about what was surprising and how he hit it perfectly, it's the silent devotion, and he really took a risk, a different risk, and it came across. He got that feeling in sound of the silence. It's just fantastic. It's really great. Before we close, I have a question for you, if I may.
Sure.
And that is this. So I come to this music from a Jewish and Western perspective. So cantorial music is a surprising combination. One of the difficulties with it is always that it's actually an Eastern musical format trying to be squeezed into Western notation. So a lot of it is based off the Arabic maqam system.
Right.
So then we put them in. So anytime you end up in that, however you analyze it, weird Phrygian mode or that double harmonic minor mode, that's actually a borrow. It doesn't really exist. Or there'll be stuff that's written in the Mixolydian mode, which we don't really have a key signature for in Western music. You have to just flatten the seventh. So I'm always looking at this stuff, very interested to see how does this translate into a more purely classical Western music form. And so my question for you is, coming from the side of seeing so much great classical Western music being written both for the theater and for the church, how does this rank and compare? Because you're really bringing in almost a foreign musical format into a different type of notation and expression. So that's what I wanted to know from you. I know it's a broad question, but how does that look? Did he do a good job? How does it sit with the rest of the repertoire? How does it compare in your mind to some masses, to similar level pieces?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think he succeeds well at fusing those two things. I think perhaps because he wasn't immersed in it throughout his childhood, that he came to it with fresh eyes and therefore was able to come in from outside and see things and bring them together more in that way. Again, it reminds me of some experiences I had with my college choirs where we learned some Turkish and Arabic music that was in maqams and dealing with all these scales before we went over, and how it's crossing over that divide between musical East and West is a huge chasm to overcome, but it really opens the ears and the mind to another way of thinking. And I think it's interesting how it seems like he's probing that. He's trying to understand it and incorporate it in, and at times, especially in the fifth movement, he's really feeling his way around. He says it took him 2 years to write the last movement. And sometimes when something takes you a long time to write and it's not flowing out, you can tell that in the music, but that makes for some of the struggle. So I think you know, it makes it a much more individual statement coming from him.
Yeah.
And I think that's what really connects audiences to it and musicians, because you can tell there's a real person there. He's not just writing according to a formula. He's trying to get inside a tradition, make it his own. And as he said, he really aspired to write a piece that had universal connection. And
Yeah.
I think he's succeeded in that. And that's why it's a great piece for us to conclude the season with.
Oh, that is. Thanks for telling me that. It's really nice to hear that, because I know these texts so well. So hearing it set to music in any way that's pretty, to me, is moving. So I'm always interested to see how that affects people who are like, I don't know what these words are in this language necessarily. It doesn't have a direct connection to me, but then it comes across and you feel that. That's really, really nice and gratifying to hear. Just a pleasure.
Yeah. So thanks so much, Benny, and guess we'll see you in a couple of weeks. It's
Can't
coming
wait.
closer.
It's a
Both
pleasure.
of us, I know, talking to Julia, are struggling with that last movement.
We'll
The
get it right.
entrances come out of nowhere for the choir, because he's in this space of uncertainty and trying to and mysticism, trying to connect with the holy other. So we all look forward to it.
We'll make sure we keep our feet planted enough on the ground that we don't lose it too much in the mysticism, and we get through the piece. It's going to be great.